What are we supposed to do about the difficulties of this life? Does Christianity give us a way to access the light of men? Or is that light of men relegated to when we pass away from this world? Hello and welcome back to the Christian Kabbalah channel. I am so happy you're here. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button. We're trying to bring this information to as many people as we can. My name is Shimon Klinger, and we are going through the Gospel of John verse by verse. We are currently in what is known as the Prologue of the Gospel of John, which is the first 18 verses. These verses contain deep and hidden secrets, which are then discussed and detailed in the rest of the book. So let's read the first couple of verses of John, and then we're going to focus in on John 1:4. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It was in the beginning with God. Through it all things were made, and without it not one thing was made that has been made. John 1:4. In it was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not master it or overcome it. Again, John 1:4 reads, in it was the life, and the life was the light of men. So let's talk about this verse. What does it mean that life is the light of men? Now, the church teaches that Jesus is the life and Jesus is the light of men. And what they're referring to when the church says that Jesus is the life and the light of men, that when we receive Jesus into our hearts, that somehow separates us from the world, and therefore we access some kind of new reality, right? This is where the Christian cliche of being of the world, not in the world, arises from, right? When we accept Jesus into our life, we are now no longer of this world, we are instead in the world, and that is what Jesus provides. But this presents us with an issue, and that issue is that we are still subjected to the miseries of this life, right? If you look closely at our day-to-day lives, are they completely filled with light, as John 1 hints that they can be? Or are we subjected to pain and suffering and misery? And that is what oftentimes how we experience this world. And this begs us to ask a more broader question. And that question is, well, why is life so difficult? And if life is so difficult, or if life can be so difficult, then what does Jesus provide us? What does the church provide us? Now, I know the answer to this question, right? The church and the whole path of Christianity is really for one reason, and that is to be accepted into heaven once we pass away from this world. And while that might be true, that creates what I believe is kind of a glaring hole within Christianity, right? So if we accept Jesus into our heart, and that all of a sudden grants us access to heaven, well, what about the intervening years that between now and the time that we get access into heaven? Especially because this life of ours is so fraught oftentimes with difficulties and pain and suffering. However, John 1:4 sort of promises we can access a greater type of life, a life filled with blessings and miracles, right? If the life is the light of men, then our light can and should be filled with life. Now, this is not what the church teaches. The best quote that I found on this is from Pastor John MacArthur, who says this: the only way you're living your best life is if you're going to hell. So if that's the case, what are we supposed to do about the difficulties of this life? Does Christianity give us a way to access the light of men? Or is that light of men relegated to when we pass away from this world? Are we supposed to live our best life now? Are we supposed to experience light and blessings while we're in this world? And that's the main question that John 1:4 presents us. So Kabbalah has a lot to say about this issue. Kabbalah teaches that this life now is supposed to be filled with light and blessings. In the last video, we talked about the lineage of Kabbalists and how Rav Yehuda Ashlag was one of the most elevated Kabbalists of history. wrote specifically that Deuteronomy 30:19 addresses this very question. Deuteronomy 30:19 reads this: "And you shall choose life, so that you and your descendants may live." This verse presents us with a redundancy. What does it mean to choose life so that you shall live? And Rav Ashlag subsequently answers his own question, and he says this, or what this verse refers to is a life of fulfilling the Torah and the precepts, because only then is one truly alive. This is not the case for someone living without the precepts and the Torah, because that kind of life is harder than death. Before we continue on and explain what this means, we first need to define some terms, okay? When Rav Ashlag talks about fulfilling the precepts and the Torah, what he is referring to is living a spiritual life and accessing spiritual tools that enable us to live that kind of life. What he is definitely not referring to is living a specifically Jewish religious life that is dedicated towards fulfilling mitzvot and the precepts. So if Rav Ashlag tells us that fulfilling the Torah and its precepts grants us true life or gives us the ability to be truly alive, well, Christians might perk their ears up and say, well, Jesus already talked about it. In Matthew 5:17, when Jesus is speaking at the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "I have come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them." So Jesus says that he fulfills the law and the prophets, but he doesn't explain what that means. However, if we look elsewhere within the Christian scriptures, Paul tells us what it means to fulfill the law and the prophets. In Romans 13, Paul says this: "For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. All the commandments are summed up in this one decree: love your neighbor as yourself. And therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." So this presents religious Christians with kind of a dilemma. What does it mean to fulfill the law? Does Jesus alone fill the law? And if so, what does that mean? Does that mean that simply all we must do is accept Jesus into our heart in order to fill the law? Or is Paul correct when he says that to love thy neighbor is fulfilling the law? Which one is it? Let's return to Rav Ashlag and what Rav Ashlag says about fulfilling the Torah. Again, Rav Ashlag is commenting on the verse Deuteronomy 30:19 that says, "Choose life so that you and your descendants might live." So in order to explain what it means to choose life, Rav Ashlag uses an illustration. And that illustration is that of a father and a son. Now, the father is a wealthy father, and he then says, "I want you to pick a particularly beautiful piece of land." And then what does the father do? He takes his son over to a very specific and very beautiful part of his land, and he says, "Son, choose this land." And this is what it means, according to Rav Ashlag, to choose life. And according to Rav Ashlag, what does this illustration mean? Well, it means simply that we as humans are able to live whatever type of life we want to live. We are free to do anything that we want to do. However, the Creator, by giving us the spiritual path and tools to keep us on the spiritual path, has in essence said, choose this type of life. The reason why the Creator did this is because though we are free to choose what type of life we want to live, only when we walk the spiritual path, meaning only when we are actively making decisions to get closer and closer to our soul, are we guaranteed a life that is filled with light, blessings, and peace. We avoid this material world that is often fraught with pain and suffering and death. And this is guaranteed, so says Rav Ashlag, to those people who are walking the spiritual path. That according to Kabbalah, how we experience this world and how we experience this life, it's wholly dependent upon our relationship with God. If we are actively seeking a spiritual life, drawing ever closer every day, taking steps to listen to the words of our soul and to act upon them, then we are given access and granted freedom from the pains and suffering of this world. However, if we are not doing that at all, we are going to be living a completely different existence where we are going to be encountering pain and suffering and death. According to Kabbalah, that the light gives us nothing but blessings. However, it is only through the viewpoint of the vessel do we interpret all of the things that happen to us. So if we are experiencing any type of darkness, negativity, that's simply an indication of the additional work that we need to do. So then we must then ask ourselves, well, what does it mean to elevate spiritually? And to do this, we can return to what Paul says in Romans 13, and what also the Kabbalists agree, which is the precept of love thy neighbor. According to both Kabbalists and the Apostle Paul, love thy neighbor is the key to fulfilling the Torah. Now we can use love thy neighbor as a sort of yardstick to determine where we're at on our spiritual path. Maybe pause this video and think to yourself, look back at your day. How often did you go outside of yourself to love others? Did you truly, in every moment of your day, love others as you love yourself? Because it's a humbling thought. Are we truly, in every moment, fulfilling the precept of love thy neighbor? When we do that, it's very easy to see that though love thy neighbor is easy to say, it's an extremely difficult precept to live. And that's why there are the spiritual tools that enable us to live love thy neighbor a little bit easier. So if we can look within and recognize that we are relatively far from loving thy neighbor in all situations, then the spiritual path emerges. Because what's the spiritual path? The spiritual path is taking small and gradual steps to open ourselves to love people deeper, to love people in a better and greater way. Spiritual path is taking steps to fulfill love thy neighbor. And when we do that, we understand that every situation that is given to us is simply another opportunity to love thy neighbor in a greater way than we did maybe yesterday. The spiritual path emerges. And this is what John 1:4 is simply referring to. John 1:4 is talking about the spiritual path. In it was life, and the life was the light of men. We are talking about actively taking steps towards becoming our divine self through our soul. As we're approaching love thy neighbor, we also are elevating above the tribulations and difficulties of this world, because we begin to realize slowly and slowly that every situation is given us from the light, from God, and that there is nothing to be fearful or afraid of. And once we remove all other forms of negativity from our soul, we realize that there is nothing but God's beneficence and God's love and God's goodness in this world. If you are interested in bolstering your current walk with Jesus, in the description box below are links to Kabbalah classes that will enable you to begin to walk the spiritual path, maybe in a more efficient way than you have ever before. Have a great, amazing day. If you like what you saw, like, subscribe, hit the notification button, share with your friends. Have an amazing day. I love you all. See you guys all soon.